Okay, it's very much a pleasure to be here. Sanhedrin, I just heard you learning Sanhedrin. Sikha, combinations, what would you prefer? Sanhedrin? Where are you up to in Sanhedrin? First parak? Above? Okay, all right, maybe we'll start with that. Okay. 1 second. The Gemara in Kedushin, Daf Samachem with Beis, discusses two different types of edus. There's edus which is Lakim Hadavar and edus which is Labir Hadavar. The Gemara says the following, that Mishmei Darav HaMakadesh Beino Beina Enimu Kodeshes. You give Kesef Kedushin to a woman and no one else is there. The Kedushin is not Chal whatsoever. Lashon HaGemara is L'Makayme Milsa Ela B'Sadeh. In order to secure the Kedushin, so Ishus requires Eidim. Ishus requires Eidim. The Gemara on the very same daf, toward the bottom of the daf, mentions the case of Chaluka Sanachla. You're dividing a Yerusha. So in such a case, the Gemara says, is it really true that there's no Chalos? It's not binding. The Chaluka is not Chal unless they're Eidim. So that's where the Gemara says the very great Chiddush, Lo Ivrei Sadeh El L'Shakrei. The entire purpose of Eidim is only to avoid sheker. If we all agree, everything is fine. All of a sudden, you're going to say this, I'll say that. I can summons Eidim in order indeed to confer that indeed is the case. That's not called Eidus Lakim Hadavar. That's called Eidus which is Labir Hadavar. In case there is a dispute, there's a machlokes. Oh, so in such a case now, we'll summons Eidim, they'll be able to resolve that difficulty. So it's an incredibly fascinating daf, Kedushin Samachem with Beis, that already the Gemara says that there are two different types of Eidus. There's Eidus which is Lakim Hadavar, that's true when it comes to Git and Kedushin. There is Eidus Labir Hadavar, and that's true when it comes to cases of Dinim Amana. So that, no doubt, is a fascinating Chiddush. There are differences between that type of Eidus. There is, for example, a Tosus Sanhedrin Daf Tes Amud Aleph that raises the following issue, Machlokas the Ri and the Rashbam. When exactly do you have a Shem Eid? A Shem Eid. Is that Mishas Re'iyah or is that Mishas Haggadah? Typically speaking, an Eid has a twofold responsibility. They witness, they go to Beis Din to testify. At what point in time, al Pidin, do you become an Eid? L'may nafkamina, Tosa says, number one, what about the principle of Ein Eid Nasadayan? Is that B'shas Re'iyah or is that B'shas Haggadah? Number two, the principle of Nim Secher Kava Pasal, Edusan B'Teila. You know what, if one is Pasal, that means the entire kat is dismissed. What exactly does that mean? Is that dependent on Shas Re'iyah or is that dependent on Shas Haggadah? That's 2 days in Tosus. That's pretty incredible. Maybe an Eid means an Eid Haroeh with Kavanah L'Haid, or maybe no, you need an Eid Hameid, an Eid Hameid. That's a very, very fundamental machlokes. There is a sugin Makos and Davav where the Gemara says the following, that how can you possibly argue there's a principle of Nimtzecha Kol Pasal Dusan B'Teil? How can that possibly be? The Gemara says, I'll tell you something that would be absurd. Horeg Yatzil, Rovei Yatzil. Let the perpetrator himself exonerate himself. Obviously, the person who commits the crime, didn't he see the crime? And if indeed there is a principle of Nimser Kol Pasal Dusan B'Teil, so therefore that's it. The Edom will go and they saw it together. What do you mean? That I was part of the kat. And therefore the entire kat is going to be disallowed. How can that possibly be? You know what the Gemara answers? No. Al pishnai midim yakum davar, b'mekayme davar akasav medaber. B'mekayme davar akasav medaber. What exactly does that mean? Mekayme davar? One possibility is as follows. Well, if you assume that you only become an Eid b'shas Haggadah, not b'shas Re'iyah, oh, that's exactly the teretz of the Gemara. The fact that everyone saw it together is insufficient. You only become an Eid b'shas Haggadah. Why? Because b'mekayme davar akasav medaber. When is the Kiyum? The Kiyum is not b'shas Re'iyah. The Kiyum is b'shas Haggadah. So maybe that's exactly what the Gemara says, that, you know what, it's dependent on Haggadah, not dependent on Re'iyah. And if you assume that's not true, you become an Eid b'shas Re'iyah. What does the Gemara mean? Here I'll tell you a very, very different yesod. In order to become an aid, to apply that principle of nimtze echad kol pasuk l'isem b'teila, you have to have a shem aid. You have to have a shem aid. Let's say you're a baldavar. You're the osa davar. Does the osa davar have a shem aid? Oh, that's the chiddush of the Gemara. Take a look there at the Rosh. That's the chiddush of the Gemara. At Perek Aleph Siman Yud Gimel in the Rosh. No, that's the chiddush of the Gemara. But mekame davar kosam medaber means that yes, if you're an aid puzzle, then I apply the principle of nimtzeh karva puzzle, do some betela. But you know what? If you're a baldavar, you don't have a shem aid, and that's a very, very important yesod. In order to apply the principle of nimtzeh karva puzzle, you have to have a shem aid who is puzzle. If you have a hafkasa eidus, you don't have a shem aid. You're not even part of the club. You're not part of the kat. So therefore, that certainly doesn't apply. Oh, so one example would be a case of a baldavar. Any other possibilities? An asivis, a similar beis, cheresh shot of a katan, eved ish akum. 6 other cases, no? Where a person al pidin does not have a shem aid. Let's assume, for example, you have a group and one is a woman, one is a guy. You're going to say nimtzeh kavah pasulus betela. They're not even part of the kat. That's a very, very important yesod. You didn't do palgin dibura yet? No, daftes. Okay, when you get to palgin dibura, the Rabbi writes that's the chiddush. That's the difference between edush, where nimtzeh a kavah pasul, or edush shabat mikzos sabat lakula, as opposed to palgin dibura. In order to go ahead and to say palgin dibura, it means you need a hafkas edus. If everything is bechlal ha'edus, that's when you use the principle of edus shabat l'miktzos sabat lakulas. Remember that? No, that's critical for the sugya and daf tes and the sugya and daf yud. That's something which is absolutely critical. Oh, so we have a principle of nimtzeh kar pasul l'isem b'teila. Machlokes the Ri and the Rashbam, whether it applies b'shas re'iyah or whether it applies b'shas haggadah. Ritva kedushin daf mem gimel. How does this apply to edus l'kiyum adavar? Edus l'kiyum adavar. In Edis Libira Davar, I understand, the aid has a dual responsibility, Re'iyah Haggadah. What about Edis L'kiyum Davar? You're asked to be an aid kedushin. Your responsibility is Re'iyah and Haggadah. When was the last time an aid kedushin was made in Bezdin? Your role as an aid kedushin is simply Re'iyah and Re'iyah alone. So therefore, the Ritva writes the Chiddush, Kedushin Daf Mem Gimel, that everyone is going to agree. We apply the principle of nimtzeh kar pasul l'isem b'teila b'shas re'iyah. Wow. And that, the Ritva writes, creates an enormous problem. No? Imagine you're at a chasana, there's an Eid Kedushin, but who is watching the Mesiras HaTabas, the Maisa Kedushin? You know what? The mother-in-law. The Nesivas. They're not part of the kat. Okay, that's good. The father-in-law. What do you mean? He's a karov, no? Nimtzeh kar pasul b'teila. So you know what the Ritva writes? That's why we need Yichud Ha'edim. You have to be Miyached the Edim. These are the Edim to the exclusion of all others. Otherwise you have a problem. Nimtzeh kar pasul l'isem b'teila. And why does the Ritva write this in Kedushin Daf Mem Gimel? Because that's where the Gemara says explicitly that you do not need Yichud Ha'edim. You do not need Yichud Edim. Yeah, that's true. You have a Chassan, you have a Kalan, you have 2 Edim. You don't need Yichud Edim. That's a Gemara Mufareshes, Kedushin Daf Mem Gimel. But if you have 100 people watching, and part of them are Krovim and Psilim, then you absolutely need Yichud Edim. You don't require Yichud Edim because you don't have a Shem Eid unless there's Yichud Edim. But you do require Yichud Edim in order to avoid a problem, Nimtzeh and Kavah Pasul, do some B'teila. That's a very, very important chiddush. So that's really enough kamina, din daraisa, between Edis L'kiyum Davar, as opposed to cases of Edis Libira Davar, and indeed there are more. But this distinction between that which is the Kiyum Milsa and that which is Lo Ivra Shakre, I'll tell you the following. That doesn't only apply when it comes to Edim. That applies when it comes to other cases as well. You know what? I'll tell you the following. Right? You're not going to do this so fast, but the sugya of shtaros. You know what? There are 2 different types of shtar. There's a shtar kinyan and there's a shtar raya. There's a shtar raya. Let's assume, for example, let's use our example of a chasana. Now, the ksuva. You know what? The chassan is mishabed himself for the shiburim bevishus. That's clear. That's a Tnai Bezdin. And even above beyond the Tnai Bezdin, you've been to a chassan stish, a kinyan chalipin is made, and the chassan obligates himself to. Well, if that's clear, if there already is a chiyuv, so why do you need a ksuva? You know what a ksuva is? A ksuva is a shtar raya. A shtar raya. Let's assume, for example, that the chassan says it didn't happen. Let's assume, for example, the chassan said, of course it happened, but I already prepaid all the obligations of Ishus. You know what? Oh, the Isha is holding a shtar raya, shtar chabiyad mabai, and therefore she indeed will be nemenes. She will carry the day. The shtar does not break or make the chiyuvim. What do you mean? That's a Tnai Bezdin, and there was a kinyan. But that is lebir hadavar. And then you have a shtar which is not just lebir hadavar. The shtar creates the chalos. Let's assume, for example, you have a shtar kinyan of karka, as an example. Your kona karka ayadei shtar. It's not that simply the shtar serves as a deed that the karka is mine. The means of hakna, the means of acquisition, the way I acquired the karka was ayadei shtar. That's not just a shtar raya, that is a shtar kinyan. And you know what? There are two different types of shtar kinyan. There's a shtar kinyan of dinim amanos, and there's a shtar kinyan of isser v'heter. Sometimes you can have a shtar kinyan of isurim, sometimes you have a shtar kinyan of mammon. What are the examples of a shtar kinyan of isurim? 3 different cases, right? A get, a shtar kedushin, and a shtar shechur. Those are 3 examples of a shtar kinyan and a shtar kinyan of isser v'heter. So that's very fundamental. There are 2 great types of shtaros, kinyan and raya, like there are 2 different types of edus l'kim hadavar, edus l'bir hadavar. And as a subcategory, there are 2 different types of shtari kinyan. One is a shtar kinyan dinim amanos, kiniyas hakarka, right? And the other is a shtar kinyan of isser v'heter. So, for example, Rabbi Soloveitchik used to often comment, the machlokas of Edei Mesira Karse, Edei Chasima Karse, is only when it comes to a shtar kinyan. It's not when it comes to a shtar raya. A shtar raya, of course, requires Edei Chasima. What kind of raya is a shtar if it's not signed? If it's not signed. And what's unique about the shtar kinyan v'isser v'heter? We used to like the Ramban, Gittin Daf Peivav, that's when you require lishma. Lishma is only necessary when it comes to a shtar kinyan of isser v'heter. A shtar mechiras karka does not require lishma, but a get requires lishma, a shtar kedushin requires lishma, a shtar shechur requires lishma, because shtar kinyan of isser v'heter. That's critically important, no? Okay, so we're getting a little bit closer. No, there are 2 different types of edus. That's the kli in the Gemara. There are 2 different types of shtaros, a shtar kinyan and a shtaraya. Now what about when it comes to bezdin? So you've learned that, the Mishnah tells us in Daf Beis that there are certain institutions that require a bezdin of shlosha. What exactly is the role of bezdin? So here I'll tell you the following, that the role of bezdin, sometimes the role of bezdin really is the bir hadavar. There's a din Torah, and you know what? Bezdin has to render a psak. They have to say chayiv, they have to say pater. That, of course, is a bezdin which is lebir hadavar, okay? And sometimes you're going to have a bezdin which is not just lebir hadavar. No. Who says there's any bir at all? Maybe it's a bezdin which is the kiyum hadavar. Just like, for example, that Gemara in Kedushin of Samachay, that lo mekayim milsa ela bisadi, that certain institutions that get in Kedushin requires edus l'kiyum hadavar, and that's part of the principle of ein davar shebe'er v'pachos mishnayim. That's the Reb Chaim, Perek Daled of Chasiyum Mechalitza, that there are 2 different dinim when it comes to ein davar shebachos mishnayim. One is lebir hadavar, one is l'kim hadavar. Lebir hadavar means the following, that you know what? This woman is being accused of being an eshes ish zinsa. So in such a case, how are you going to prove that case? Not an eid echad, but shnei eidim. That's ein davar shebachos mishnayim, which is lebir hadavar. The znus does not require edus l'kim hadavar. But sometimes you're going to have cases where that you need edus l'kim hadavar, gittin, kedushin. What about yibum? Does yibum require edus l'kim hadavar? Very unclear. No. You go through all of the Rambam, In Hilchos Yibum V'Chalitza, the Ram never mentions a need for Edim when it comes to Yibum. Tosus discusses this. Kedushin Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis. Tosus discusses it head on. And you read the Tosus time and time again. And you can read the Tosus in opposite ways. Either Tosus is definitely saying you need Edim, or definitely saying that you don't need Edim. It's, you keep on reading the Tosus. The Shar HaMelech writes in Perek Beis of Hilchos Yibum, it's Mefurish in Tosus, Kedushin Daf Yud Beis, that Yibum requires Edim. And the Gon writes in Shulchan Aruch, the Bir Hagra, Kuf Samechav, that Tosus says you don't need Edim. You don't need Edim. You keep on reading the Tosus, very, very unclear. It's Mefurish Machlokas Rishonim. On that daf, the writ for the Tosus Rosh writes you need Edim. And there's a Tshuvas HaRashba, Chelik Dalet, Semishin Chavches, where the Tshuvas HaRashba writes that no Edim is necessary for Yibum. No Edim is necessary for Yibum. Well, so we know when it comes to Gittin Kedushin, you need Edis L'Kiyum Adavar. What about when it comes to Yibum? Variant. Why should Yibum be any different? Reb Chaim says the Birur is as follows, that Reb Chaim Perek Dal Chatez Ayin in the Chesiv Machalitza, because you know why you need Edis L'Kiyum Adavar? That's a function of Das Davar Shebe'erva. Das Davar Shebe'erva. There's certain institutions that require a heightened level of Das, and that means that the chalos, the kinyan, has to be made bifnei acherim. That's a function of Das. Does Kedushin require Das? Absolutely yes. Gittin require Das? Absolutely yes. Yibum. Oh, that's the Mishnah Yevamos Daf Nun Gimel. Yibum, haba yivimto, ben b'shogeg, ben b'mezid, ben bonus, ben b'rotzam. Yibum does not require Das. Yibum does not require Das Davar Shebe'erva. So if Yibum doesn't require Das, that's the chiddush of Reb Chaim, that it doesn't require Edis L'Kiyum Adavar. And therefore the Rambam never mentions any need for Edim when it comes to Yibum. And the Rambam seems to indicate that, there in Perek Dalet, that Chalitza, even if there's a Chalitza which is without Edim, the Chalitza also is meaningful. Meaningful. It's what the Rambam calls a Chalitza Psula. But meaningful. Wow. So Edis L'Kiyum Adavar is necessary. Understand, when it comes to Davar Shebe'erva, maybe as a function of Das. Bezdin. What is the role of Bezdin? So when it comes to a typical case, the Imamans B'Shlosha, you know what the role of Bezdin is? L'Kiyum Hadavar. I say you owe me $100, and that's denied. So Bezdin will render a psak L'Kiyum Hadavar. What kind of milsa? What kind of Kiyum Hadavar is that? Let's say Bezdin paskins that I'm chayiv. The psak generates the chiyuv. I'm always chayiv, no? I was chayiv from the onset as well. You know what? You owe me $100. It's not worth my time to take you to Bezdin to be gova $100. You don't owe me the $100. The psak din of Bezdin does not create the chiyuv in any shape or form. Rabbi Kiveger, the Gilyon Hashas, and the Fehemad Aleph. The psak din of Bezdin is L'Bir Hadavar. It's not L'Kiyum Hadavar. But then you have cases where really that's not true. Then you have cases where the role of Bezdin is not L'Bir Hadavar. The role of Bezdin is the Kiyum Hadavar. Just like there's certain institutions that require Edis L'Kiyum Hadavar, sometimes you require a Bezdin which is indeed L'Kiyum Hadavar. A Bezdin is L'Kiyum Hadavar. Let's assume, for example, that Gerus requires a Bezdin, no? L'Sugi V'Amos Daf Memei, Ger Tzara Shlosha, Mitshpat Ksibei. Gerus requires a Bezdin Shlosha. Gerus requires a Bezdin Shlosha. That's L'Bir Hadavar. Maybe certainly it's true, but that maybe part of the responsibility of Bezdin is to make sure, L'Varer, that, yes, that this is a worthy candidate of Gerus. But the need for a Bezdin L'Kiyum Hadavar is to create the Gerus. Just like when it comes to Gittin Kedushin, Loma Kaimim Milsa L'Bachi. Oh, so the same thing is true when it comes to cases, for example, of Gerus. For example, Chalitza requires a Bezdin of Shlosha. L'Bir Hadavar. That's L'Bir Hadavar. Isn't that L'Kiyum Hadavar? Institution of Chalitza requires a Bezdin. Okay? Smichas Hakenim, your Mishnah, no? Param davar shel tzibur. The Rabbi writes in Pirush Mishnayos, you saw, no? Smichas Zakeni means Smichas HaChachamim. No? You saw that, no? The Pasha B'Shan Gemara, it means Param davar shel tzibur. Yeah. That requires a bezin. That's lebir hadavar. That's lebir hadavar. That's a bezin lakim hadavar. Even, for example, smichas hakenim, whether it's mentioned in the Mishnah, whether it isn't mentioned, but smichas hakenim, that's a bezin lebir hadavar. That's a bezin lakim hadavar. Lakim hadavar. Wow. So you can have smichas hakenim. You can have chalitza. You have cases of gerus, and bezin is necessary. Bezin is necessary when it comes to bir hadavar. Bezin is necessary the kim hadavar. So you have different roles of batei dinim. Let's say the Sanhedrin, bezin hagadol. Sometimes bezin hagadol is necessary the bir hadavar. The bir hadavar. Kol davar hagadol v'yelecha. You can have certain piskei din that are so monumental. That psak should be rendered al yidei haSanhedrin. But then you have certain cases ein mosifin ala ir v'ala azara. No? Or minui hadayanim. You know, those are cases, are they not? In mosifin, that's lebir hadavar. In order to go ahead and to expand the boundaries of Mikdash, the Sanhedrin, it's a psak, chayiv repater. So all of a sudden you find that distinction when it comes to edus, that's relevant when it comes to shtaros, that's relevant when it comes to a bezin shlosha, that's relevant when it comes to bezin hagadol. That, you know what, that certain institutions require bezin the kiyum hadavar and certain indeed do not. You did part of the sugya of bezdin shakel? A bezdin shakel? Just a little bit, no? Why do you have to have a bezdin nota? Why do you have to have a bezdin nota? I'll tell you very simply, because if bezdin has to render a psak, and you have 4 dayanim, 6 dayanim, now, how are you going to do that? So 3 and 3, 2 and 2. You're going to be stalemated. So therefore, you need. Is that really true though? Is the reason that you require a bezdin nota because otherwise you're going to expose yourself because you know what? That you're not going to be able to render the psak. But you know what? Isn't there a halacha or is there a halacha of bezdin nota and bezdin shaka when it comes to bezdin lakim hadavar? Bezdin lakim hadavar. No? There's such a tosis, no? Where's that tosis? You saw? Tosis Yevamos. Kufalef, right? The Tosis Yevamos stuff Kufalef raises the following. The Gemara applies the question of a bezdin nota to chalitza. The Gemara applies the principle of bezdin nota when it comes to smichas hayadayim. Tosis is very bothered why that should be true. Bezdin is not rendering any psak whatsoever. Right? That's a bezdin lakim hadavar. And if a bezdin lakim hadavar and there is no psak that's rendered, no. So in such a case, why do you have to have a bezdin nota? So Tosis has 2 terutzim. It's very fundamental. Maybe even in such a bezdin, there are dinim that bezdin has to weigh in on. Is this a proper shoe for chalitza? Too big, too small? Is it kosher? Is it pasul? The smichas hadayim was done. Was it done b'chol kolcha? Was it not done b'chol kolcha? Wow. So Tosis maintains in that teretz that really in principle the reason that you need a bezdin nota is lebir hadavar. But even in cases where a bezdin is lakim hadavar, they have to be qualified to be able to render certain decisions. Or Tosis says, maybe not. This is halacha in the shem bezdin, even if it's a bezdin lakim hadavar. Even if there's no psak whatsoever. We'll have a posek on the side, he'll decide that. But you know what? That the bezdin lakim hadavar. Part of the definition of chefza shel bezdin means you have to have a bezdin. A bezdin nota. That's something which is stunning. No? You have to say Liran, Har Kokos Tisha V'Kohen. No? A bezdin for Shuma, that sounds like a bezdin shakel. Doesn't sound like a bezdin nota. But that's a tosus. Now let me ask you the following question. What about mumchim? When our Mishnah says the following, Dinim Amos B'Shlosha. And you know what? Let's assume, for example, let's say Gzelos V'Chavolos. You need Shlosha mumchim. Why are mumchim? Why are smuchim necessary? Why do you need smicha? Why is that necessary? Is that only in a bezdin lebir hadavar? Or does that apply to a bezdin lakim hadavar? That's incredibly fundamental machlokas rishonim. No? If I have a bezdin lakim hadavar, do I need smicha? So let's take the case of Gerus. Does Gerus require mumchim? Does Gerus require bezin shlosha? That's a Gemara Mufareshes. Ger tzara shlosha mishpat ksiv bei. Mishpat ksiv bei. That means you have to have three dayanim. Three dayanim. That's clear. That's clear. No. So Tosfos is bothered. Yivamas kedushin. No. That. How do you have Gerus b'zman hazeh? If we don't really have the smicha of old, so how do you have Gerus b'zman hazeh? How do you have Gerus? So Tosfos is the following. No. One passage in Tosfos shlichusayu. Shlichusayu. Wow. That's a very great chiddush. You learn the sugyas of shlichusayu, no? The first nesivas. Nechoshem mishpan. No semen aleph. That, you know what? That is shlichusayu midin hefker bezin hefker, is it not? No? The shlichusayu transcend areas of mammon. In areas of mammon, hefker bezin hefker. I know. Can you apply a principle of shlichusayu when it comes to areas of isser v'heter? So Tosfos was willing to apply shlichusayu in areas of isser v'heter. You see, the shlichusayu is not just hefker bezin hefker. That's relevant in areas of mammon and cases beyond. That's a very, very great chiddush. A very great chiddush. Indeed, to assume that that's true. But Tosfos is willing to apply that even to gerus. The reason we have gerus b'zman hazeh, even though we don't have mumchim, is based on shlichusayu. The other teres that Tosfos gives is exeris hakasuv, l'doro seichem. The Torah says that, you know what, you're going to have gerus l'doro seichem throughout their generations. That's true, that's the Gemara. But the Gemara is not talking about dayanim. That Gemara is talking about hartzaz damim, carbon. That, you know what, you can have gerus even without a carbon. That I know. Tosfos says, no, that's a much broader halacha. Whatever the requirements of gerus would be, even mumchim, b'zman hazeh, not necessary. Wow. That's a very, very great chiddush of Tosfos. But what's the assumption of Tosfos? Kedushin Yivamos, that the starting point is you need mumchim. The question is, what about b'zman hazeh when we don't have that? But the starting point, clearly, mumchim is necessary. And that's against the Rashba, that's against the Rambam. The Rashba writes mefurish. After all, shlosha gemiri, mumchim no gemiri. The Gemara just says, ger tzara shlosha, mishpak sivbe. Ger tzara shlosha, three. Three are necessary, that's clear. The Gemara never says you have to have three mumchim. When you look in the Rambam Menuchas Yisur Rabia, and the Rambam discusses all the dinim of gerus, the Rambam never mentions any requirement for mumchim. You would have expected the Rambam to say, if the Rambam agrees with Tosfos, that the starting point is you need mumchim. B'zman hazeh, you don't need mumchim either because of dorasech meshlichusayu. The Rambam never mentions mumchim whatsoever. So that's a very fundamental machlokes. Gerus, according to the Rambam, according to the Rashba, never required mumchim. And according to Tosfos, it does, but a din daraisa of shlichusayu, or a din daraisa of the Doro Seichem. That's a very, very fundamental machlokes. What is that machlokes? Well, everybody agrees. Let's assume, for example, gzelos v'chavalos, a bezin of shlosha mumchim. That's clear. Does that apply to gerus? Why should gerus be different? Because gerus is not a bezin l'bir hadavar. Gerus is a bezin l'kiyum hadavar. And here I'll ask you a very fundamental question. Mumchim. Is that a function of bezdin, or is that a function of hora? That's the chakira. Why is it that the Torah says you require dani mumchim? One answer is as follows: that what do you mean? That hora. After all, a psak requires a mumche. Well, another possibility is psak, not psak. Bezdin requires smuchim. So whatever is done al yedei bezdin requires danyam smuchim. No. Whenever you have halacha, psak, that requires a mumche. What would an afkamina be? Well, what an afkamina? Let's say you have a bezdin l'kiyum hadavar, where a bezdin is not rendering a psak, but rather, of course, you need a ma'aseh bezdin l'kiyum hadavar. Do you need mumchim? So Tosfos says, absolutely yes. A bezdin l'kiyum hadavar requires smuchim. What about b'zman hazeh shlichusayu or the Doro Seichem? You know what the chiddush of the Rambam Shita is? This is how Soloveitchik explained the Rambam Shita, that smicha is a function of hora. If you have a bezdin l'kiyum hadavar, you don't need smuchim. And therefore there's no need for smuch when it comes to gerus, there's no need for smuch when it comes to chalitza. It's a bezdin which is the kiyum davar. Not only bizman hazeh, but you never required. So that's a very fundamental machlokas then. The Rambam, Tosfos, whether smicha is a function of hora, whether smicha is a function of bezdin. You know, the Rambam has a very, very great chiddush. You can have smicha l'dvarim hayechidim. You did that sugya, no? Yodin, yata b'choros, no? Yora doesn't require a bezdin. Yora requires a bezdin. There's no bezdin. What do you mean smicha when it comes to Yore? Smicha when it comes to Heter B'choros. Heter B'choros requires a bezdin. But yet, the Rambam says you can have smicha l'dvarim hayechidim. Smicha l'dvarim hayechidim. You know what that means? That smicha is not a function of bezdin. Smicha is a function of hora. Hora requires smicha. So if you have a bezdin l'kiyum davar, you don't require smicha. But if you have heter b'choros, which is a hora that doesn't require a bezdin, you do need smicha. No? Did you realize that? That's pretty incredible. You'll tell me, a Rambam, it's a Gemara. It's not a Gemara, no? What do you mean? It's a Gemara. Yore, yadin, yate b'choros. The Gemara's not talking about smicha. The Gemara's talking about heter hora. Talmud al yora elim ki not reshus merabo. That's the sugya, no? Well, obviously, whatever psak you're going to give, you have to be qualified. So you know what? There's an netilas reshus. That netilas reshus of the Gemara, is that referring to smicha? Is that really a reference to smicha, or is it not? When the Rambam quotes this, stunning, the Rambam writes, this is smicha. This is not just simply a heter hora. Bizman hazeh. We don't have smicha of old. But, we can have a form of a heter hora. You know what? A person is a samuch in the sense that, someone is telling you that he's qualified in order to. That's not smicha of old. But al yore, emkinot reshus merabo. The Gemara says, obviously, that applies to cases of yore, heter b'choros. The Rambam writes, nida. Well, smicha when it comes to dram hayechidim. Pashup Sham, the Rambam will tell you, of course. Smicha is detached from bezdin, but smicha is a function of hora. That's a very, very great chiddush, the Rambam Shita. So bezdin l'kiyum davar like gerus, no need. But you know what? A psak of nida or a psak of heter b'choros, yes. Because a function of hora. Wow, that's the chiddush, the Rambam Shita. Pashup Shat and Rambam, when the Gemara discusses a yachid mumche, what exactly does it mean? A yachid mumche has the status of bezdin? Really, the status of bezdin? Or one argue, no. That a yachid mumche is capable of hora. Pashup Shat or Sameach points out, you saw the Rambam sheet is like Rabbi Nechananel, that the yachid mumche is a samuch. Ooh. So you know what? That means that you can have a psak which is rendered in the following way. If it's a yachid mumcha, of course you can render a psak. But you know what? Even without that, if you have, three hadyotos, they can also go ahead and render such a psak. But if you're dealing with a mumche, the yachid mumcha could be done. Wow. That's a very, very great chiddush. And that's how the Rambam can pass at once, no? That the Gemara discusses what would the halacha be of Shnaim Shedanu, Dinehem Din, Ein Dinehem Din, no? Pashup Sham, the Gemara, if you hold like Rabbi Avohu, Shnaim Shedanu, Ein Dinehem Din, Dinehem Din is only if you hold like Rabbi Barava, Midaraisa Chad Ami Kosher. Some of those sugyas, the psak of the Rambam, no. Stira gluya. Maybe not at all. The Rambam in Shnaim Shedanu is referring to Shnei Hadyotos. Mashenki, when the Rambam discusses Yachid Mumcha b'Toras Hora, Yachid Mumcha means a samuch. That's the Chiddush, the Rambam Shita. Smicha Sakenim. The Rambam even writes, as I mentioned, Pirush Meshes, that's the Mishnah. That requires a bezdin. What's the role of bezdin? Pashup Shat, the bezdin is l'kiyum davar. Does that require smuchim? A bezin of smichas hakenim, does that require smuchim? Does that require smuchim? So the Rambam has, what we have is the Girs in the Rambam, something very unusual, no? Very unusual. But you know what? That smichas hakenim requires the bezin of shlosha. V'hu sheyeh echad mehem samuch. No? And one out of the three has to be samuch. One out of three has to be samuch. Yeah, that's... You ever have such a thing? A bezin of three and one samuch. A bezin of three with one samuch. How did you understand that, Rabbi? What do you mean? There's certain cases that require smicha, certain requires indeed that don't. And here the requirement of smicha sakenim is 3 dayanim and one who has smicha. How did you understand that? You saw that in Shir. So what's the Birur? Pashup Pshat the Birur is as follows. Smicha sakenim is a bezna kimadavar. L'chara, that should be like gerus. That should be a chalitza. Where there's no need for mumchim. There's no need for mumchim. And that's indeed the starting point of the Ram. There's no need for mumchim whatsoever. Okay. So you don't need 3 smuchim. Yeah, but you need one samuch. What kind of pshara is that? That one out of the three. No pashup pshat. Or Slavechik explained as follows. That, you know what the definition of smicha is? Ish and Pishad Moshe Rabbeinu. Only one who has smicha can confer smicha. You can only be a mas smicha if you have smicha. So you know what? Smicha has 2 different moving parts. Number 1 is only a mumcha can bestow mincha. Only a mumcha can bestow smicha. And number 2, the act of confirming smicha is a ma'aseh bezdin l'kiyum adavar. So how do I accommodate both of those requirements? You know what the answer is? A bezdin of shlosha, one of which has smicha. Yeah, that's mafurish, no? I was pretty excited when I heard that. No, you're you excited? No? So tell me what it takes. No, like like a dinner, whoa. The Achronim suggests maybe this is toast, and the Girsas Rambam. You know, the Rav explained, what do you mean that there are 2 dinim? There's 2 dinim. That you need the masmich and you need the bezin l'kim adavar. And therefore, of course, you have 3 dayanim, one of which has smicha. That's pretty remarkable. Zakein mamre. You know, the Mishnah tells us not everyone can be zochet to be a zakein mamre. You know, that a Talmud not. What exactly does that mean? The Rambam writes a very great chiddush in Perek Dalet Hilchos Mamrim that a zakein mamre has to be a samuch. Here's such a thing. Has to be a samuch. Nimsa chumro kulo. And this person doesn't even qualify. What, he's going to say something and that's going to undermine the koach hachachamim? Who is he? A Talmud shiore is not a candidate for a zakein mamre. Yeah, but who is exactly? Rashi's shita is it has to be older, it has to be someone who's older, it can't be someone who's younger. Higila arbaim. Okay. You know what the Rambam writes? That a zakein mamre has to be a samuch. You know, that's l'shita say. No? The Rambam shita is the smicha is not a function of bezin. Smicha is a function of hora. So that which requires hora requires a samuch. So therefore, heta b'choros is a hora, nida is a hora, yore, that's called a hora, that requires smicha. Chalitza gerus is not, that doesn't require smicha. Well, you need a formal bezdin, shnaim shadano, ein dinehem din. But you have a yachid mumcha. Yachid can be mora, not b'toras bezdin, but b'toras hara. And therefore the Rambam writes smichas hakenim, 1 out of the 3. And therefore the Rambam writes a chiddush, a din daraisa, that a zakein mamre has to be a samuch. Because you know what the zakein mamre is guilty of? He's more lasos keneged a Sanhedrin. But the first word, more lasos. More means a hora. That means a samuch. And if someone does not have, he's not considered to be within that category of. That's really stunning, that Rambam. No, but perhaps all of this indeed is l'shitase. That's something which is unusual. The Gemara describes in those Sugi Nevamos, Daf Mem Hey, Daf Mem Vav. The Gemara says this. There was a woman who says she underwent gerus. She underwent gerus. Okay, but we don't have the documentation. We don't have the people coming forward. She says years ago. Well, we don't have, so what exactly do you do? So you know what the Gemara says? Incredible. You know what? Maybe we can assume, yes, she has a chazak of being Israelis. Milo tavla l'nidasa. Milo tavla l'nidasa. Good, we're having difficulty figuring out what happened at the time of the gerus, decades ago. But Milo tavla l'nidasa. But wasn't she toveles for the purpose of nida? Wasn't she toveles for the purpose of nida? What exactly does that mean? What exactly does that mean? So Tosfos writes an incredible chiddush, But you know what that means? We don't know if there was a gerus l'shem tefillah. But milo tavlin didasa. Yeah, but the tefillah that she did regularly, let that be the tefillah of gerus. Let that be the tefillah of gerus. No? Wow. Let that be the tefillah of gerus. Yeah, but ger tzarech shlosha. You need a bezdin. Oh, so Tosfos says the following. Well, when she was tavalis l'shem nida, no one was there. Wasn't there someone there assuring that the tefillah was done properly? Wasn't there a mikveh lady who was there? A mikveh lady? Oh, so maybe one could assume that will be sufficient. Chad nami kosher. And those discusses, wait a second, can a woman serve as a dayan? Can a woman really serve as a dayan? A woman can't be an aid. And we do have a principle of Edei nasa dayan. That certainly is true. But does that really mean that if you can't qualify as an aid, you cannot be a dayan? It certainly means that the psule edus will render a dayan as pasul. But we mentioned before that nesivus, no lamed beis. A woman is an aid pasul. She's not an aid pasul. It's a hafkas of edus entirely. So would that mean that she can't serve as a dayan? Dvora, the shaftas Yisrael beisahi. What exactly does that mean? B'toras dayan or not b'toras dayan? Mar malka manilach. Oh, Dina, that Tosfos is pretty incredible. So Tosfos has the back and chad nami kosher for gerus. Chad nami kosher for gerus. That's such a great chiddush. After all, that gerus requires a bezn l'kima davar. Midaraisa chad nami kosher that you learned is a bezn l'kima davar. Midaraisa chad nami kosher maybe means when it comes to hora. That's mefurish in Rambam, no? The Rambam writes, even though midaraisa chad nami kosher, the Rambam writes, it does not mean it has a shem bezdin. If a person would be modeh in front of that single individual, the Rambam writes, that's not called a hodah b'fnei bezdin. Bezdin is shlosha. Chad nami kosher means b'toras hara. The Rambam Shita is clear that there is no possibility of assuming chad nami kosher when it comes to gerus. Wow, that's pretty heavy, no? That's pretty heavy. Yeah, but the Gemara says we don't know whether the tefillah shem gerus occurred. It's mefurish in Gemara, no? That's the Yevamos, that milo tavni dasa. So Tosfos says apparently you see that in some shape or form the tefillah l'shem nida had to work for gerus. So you have to work out that bez, and according to the Rambam, that will be impossible. You need a bez in the kima davar. And how can you argue that there was a bez in the kima davar when it comes to tefillah, which is l'shem nida? How is that even thinkable? How is that possible? You know what the Rambam writes? Stunning. Mila Tavarasta does not mean that the tefillah shem nida works for gerus. You know what it means? It means as follows. The Rambam writes something which is incredible. We don't have the proper raya going back decades whether the gerus was done properly. You know how the Rambam understands that Gemara? But look at how the woman is leading her life. She's zahira b'mitzvah kaba chamura. No? Every month she's tovla nidasa. And the gerus wasn't a good gerus. It doesn't mean that the gerus l'shem nida works l'shem tefillah l'shem gerus. No. It doesn't mean that tefillah l'shem nida works as a tefillah l'shem gerus. It means that the conduct of tovla nidasa serves as a chazaka, as a raya muchachas, that the gerus was done properly. You can connect dots. That's what the Rambam writes. Maybe the Gemara could have also said that Milo Shomer says for Shabbos. She's being medakdekes, right? And Avera Kalka Chamura. Or all that serves as a raya ledavar that the gerus was. That's mefurish in the Rambam. I'll tell you, that's exactly the Shita say. Because the way Tosas understands the Gemara that somehow Tefillah A can work for Tefillah B is impossible. It's impossible. This is a bezin lakima davar that requires shlosha. We would not assume midaraisa chana mikosher. How can it be? Raglaim ladavar. That indeed there was a chazaka that the gerus was done properly. There are many other Rambams as well. No, but this is such an important yesod. And I'll tell you, Diuk Rav Soloveitchik once suggested the same thing as when it comes to bezin agada. That you can have a bezin agada which is the Birur davar, you can have a bezin agada which is the kima davar. Sometimes the Gemara says you're going to see what was the status of Moshe Rabbeinu. This was the Yortzei Drush Rav Soloveitchik gave. What was the status of Moshe Rabbeinu? Wow. Did Moshe Rabbeinu act alone? Or did Moshe Rabbeinu, what do you mean? He was the Av Bezdin, but always acted together with the Sanhedrin. I'll tell you something to think about. The opening Mishnah, Av Bez. No? How do you know Shiv Vechad? Esveli Shivim Ish? Moshe al Gabayim. You know what that means, Moshe al Gabayim? 70 and 1, 71. Moshe acted together. Minui HaSanhedrin requires a Bezdin Shiv Vechad. How do you know? What does the Gemara say? Moshe Rabbeinu, b'makom shim v'echad kai. B'makom shim v'echad kai. That sounds stunning, no? Sometimes they say Moshe Rabbeinu acted alone, but Moshe Rabbeinu himself was the embodiment of all the Sanhedrin. And sometimes we assume that Moshe Rabbeinu was among them. Wow. That's something which is pretty stunning. And Rav Soloveitchik pointed out, that tension exists even in the Parshios themselves. When you look, for example, Parshas Yishro, it doesn't sound like Moshe Rabbeinu is acting with the Sanhedrin. You set up Sanhedrin, all the Batei Dinim, and when you come to a Davar Hakosha, then we'll go to Moshe Rabbeinu. When it comes to Parshas Baloscha, Eslo Shimizik Yishro, Moshe Rabbeinu is working together with. So that's something you have to work out, When do we see that Moshe Rabbeinu independently? What was Ma'amad al Shah Moshe Rabbeinu? Moshe Rabbeinu had the status of the Sanhedrin. Moshe Rabbeinu worked together with the Sanhedrin as the Av Bezdin. Not so clear. Not so clear from the Sugis, not so clear from the Psukim and Chumash. You know what the Rav answered, but you have to now go through everything very carefully. Now, when it comes to Hora, Moshe Rabbeinu could act alone, independent of. Imagine Moshe Rabbeinu is going to say, Kadosh Baruch Hu told me this, and what? It's going to be only in the dominion of the Sanhedrin, whether that's right, whether that's not right. You're going to disagree with Moshe Rabbeinu. How can you possibly do that? But let's assume, for example, you're not dealing with Birur davar, you're dealing with Kima davar. Moshe Rabbeinu is one. When you're dealing with the Bezdin, the Kima davar, you're not going to say Moshe Rabbeinu b'makom shim v'echad kai. When you're dealing with Birur davar, kol davar hagadol, kol davar kasha, vo'ilecha, then absolutely yes. So when you're dealing with a Hora, Moshe will act alone. When you're dealing with Kiyum hadavar, Eino chinami. That's true. So for example, Minui Melech. That's not a Hora. So that Moshe Rabbeinu did together with others. The Rambam writes, Yoshua did Melech, appointed Moshe Rabbeinu and Bezdin. Wow. Mosif Nalir Vazara. That's a Bezdin Lakima Davar. There Moshe Rabbeinu was one. When it comes to other takanos, Moshe Rabbeinu is going to act alone. Act alone. And now you have homework to do. You have to work out all the cases. I'll tell you an unbelievable diuk that Rav Soloveitchik suggested. This should get you very excited. No? You have to go through. Sometimes the Rambam says Moshe Rabbeinu. And sometimes the Rambam says Moshe Rabbeinu Beis Dino. I have to go through. And you know what's going to come out. It's just unbelievable. Whenever you're dealing with cases of Horah, the Rambam writes Moshe Rabbeinu. Whenever you're dealing with something which is Lakima Davra, the Rambam writes Moshe Beis Dino. Moshe Beis Dino. You know, you learn those Rambams over and over again. You don't even notice the diuk. You know, and then you see it, and you hear it. You go back. How could I have missed it? No, because you read it quickly sometimes. No, whenever it comes to Kiyum Davra, the Rambam writes Moshe Beis Dino. Moshe Beis Dino. And when it comes to certain takanos that were Horah, Moshe Rabbeinu Tikkun in Yisrael, Avelus and Kriyas HaTorah, Bavakam Daf Pebeis, and like all of that was Moshe Rabbeinu alone. Something which is incredible. It starts out with the Gemara says about Edus. I would run when it comes to shtaros that requires a separate shir. No, different forms of shtaros, right? And this is true when it comes to Bezdin, a Bezdin of Shlosha, and that's Gerus, and that's Chalitza, and that's Smichas Hakenim. And that's true when it comes to, ultimately, even Bezdin Hagadol. Certain diunim or B'Torah Sarah, Moshe will do that absolutely alone. But certain things, Moshe Rabbeinu, the Adan Hanavim, that's true, but nonetheless, a yachid. So that's not going to help when it comes to that which requires a broader Bezdin, which is considered to be that which is the Kiyum. These are Yosodas. Think very, very important Hagdaras that should help you through those sugyas. When you get to that sugya of Pagin and Dibura, remember, now you have to take a look at that Rosh, Makos Aleph Yud Gimel, the Ravid about the Shem Eid, the Shem Dain, the Hafka, what is a psul, what is not a psul. That's something which is critically important. Just like Nimtzar Karpos and the Sabbatei, the same thing is true when it comes to Eidul Shabbat Miktsasa, but Lukula as a corollary for that. That's something which is critically important. Let me just tell you something quick about the parsha. The parsha begins very, very simply that Eila told us Yitzchak ben Avram Holius Yitzchak. Rashi is bothered by the seeming repetition. Perhaps one could suggest the following. When you go through the world of Avos and Toldos, you see that there are two different Hagdaras of Toldos. No, you learn Bava Kama Daf Beis, The Gemara cites Shabbos and Tumah as being different models of Toldos. In Shabbos Toldos Yem Kayotze Behem, in Tumah Toldos Yem Lav Kayotze Behem. Clear? No? Why exactly is that true? So I'll tell you, it's not just Gzeirus HaKasa, that there are really two different forms of Toldos entirely. What does it mean to say that this is the Tolda of the Av? When it comes to Shabbos, I think it's clear. Let's assume, Hach Dahave B'Mishkan. The Sugin B'Vakam Daf Beis, Shabbos Tadivav, that, let's assume you have an Av Malach of Zoreya. And let's assume a Tolda Mashka Mayim Nizraim, that you watered the plant. Other cases, why is that considered to be a Tolda? You know what the answer is? Well, it shares the same Malachas Machshavas. Every one of these avos are models. So what is the essence? What is the purpose of? And, well, obviously, then, a tolda is an expansion of. Zoreh is not just simply placing a seed in the ground. That's true. But anything that promotes the growth of the plant, whether it's menachesh, whether it's weeding, mashkamayim nizraim, watering, that's going to be a tolda of Zoreya. If I would ask you conceptually, why is that a Tola? Because that's an expansion of the Av. The Av literally is placing a seed in the ground. But I'm going to broaden out anything which is in the broader sense. So that is considered as true. What about when it comes to the world of Toldos? In Tumah. That really is an expansion of, I wouldn't call that Harchava, an expansion. Let's assume, for example, a mace is Avivos HaTumah. A person comes in contact with a mace, he's an avatumah. Next to Rishon Tumah. That's an expansion of. We broaden out the definition of a mace. That a mace is not only, a cadaver, but a mace is also a person who is nogea b'mace. Is that really true? There I will tell you the following. That's a very, very different model of an av and a tolda. There I'll tell you the following. Look, The Av is a source of Tumah. Why are you Tameh if you came in contact with the mace? It's not that we're labeling you as a mace, as a nifter Rahman al-Islam, but rather any residual Tumah that you have emanates from the source of Tumah. Well, if you have contact with, there's something that rubs off. I wouldn't say it's a harchava, but I would say that, you know what, it's not a told of expansion, but it's a told of emanation. And there I would tell you that when I raise that following question, Toldosen kayotze behem, or lav kayotze behem, that I think is very mistaber. That if you're dealing with a told of expansion, I will tell you the muskal rishon is kayotze behem, kayotze. Once you define zoreya, it's not really the technical act of placing a seed in the ground, but rather gidul hakarka, gidul hapri. Okay, so what is true of A is true of B. If you're telling me that something emanates from, I understand, something rubbed off, but there's a step down. Your degree of Tumah is not the same as the Havi of Osa Tumah. And it's not at all surprising, one would assume, that Todol saying Lav Kayotze Behem. And Todol of his expansion, absolutely true, and Todol of emanation, I would say, that's not the case. The Gemara raises the following issue, that how does this translate to Nezikin? Would you say Todol saying Kayotze Behem, Lav Kayotze Behem? So I would argue as follows. Okay, let's look at the totals of Nezikin. Now, so if it's a harchava. The Torah gives you an example, Kiyigach. But that's the only case. No. It represents a hagdara, a category. Meshuna, kavanas lahazik. You know what that's called? Expansion. It makes perfect sense to argue then Todol Sehen, Kayotze Behem, similar to Shabbos, as indeed we do. There is an exception. No? Tzuros. Tzuros is the one case where we assume Todol Sehen Lav Kayotze Behem. Why exactly is true? There I will tell you the following. Why is Tzuros considered to be a Toda? You know what I'll tell you? The Av Malach is Gufo, and Tzuros is Kocho. What's the relationship of Kocho and Gufo? Kocho and Gufo, is exactly emanation, no? That exactly represents the models of Tumah, no? It's not just Gzeres HaKosav and Hilchasa, but if you're saying that one's force, one's potency emanates from, there's going to be a step down. If you're going to argue it's an expansion of, then not necessarily true. So the Maskanas HaGemara will tell you that Bava Kama fits in beautifully in terms of the Hagdara. That's the Nachlas David, no different. So I'll ask you the following question. In what sense was Yitzchak a Tolda of Avram? In what sense was Yitzchak a Tolda of Avram? You know what I would tell you? I would tell you, well, number one, clearly, Yitzchak emanated from Avram Avinu. That's clearly true, no? That's a father and son, that's clearly true. But I will tell you so much more than that, No, take a look at the Tosas HaShalem in the beginning of the Parsha. He lists 14 examples that Kol Ma She'ir LaAvram Ir LaYitzchak. Whatever happened to Avram Avinu, Yitzchak re-experienced. You know what? The life of Yitzchak was an expansion of the life of Avram Avinu. I'll give you an example. We're always so used to assuming. No? Brachos Chafav, Shachar Ben Chamarev, Avram Yitzchak and Yaakov, Yitzchak Lasoch Basada, Yuma Chavches. You know what Mincha is? What's the Lashon HaGemara? Tzilus Avram. Mincha is the Tefillah of Avram Avinu. Mufurish in Gemara that Yitzchak Mesake Mincha. Now, take a look at Tosas Yishonim and the Daf. Yuma Chavches. Who was the first person to dav Mincha? Avram Avinu. That's what the Gemara calls the Tzilus Avram. What did Yitzchak do? Yitzchak took the practice of Avram Avinu as a Yachid and he institutionalized it. He was Mesakin Tfilas Mincha. That takana was not Yesh Miyayin. Avram Avinu was Mesakin Shachris, but Avram Avinu davened Mincha. And Yitzchak, as an expansion of the legacy of Avram Avinu, took the Hanhaga of Avram Avinu and expanded. Wow. That's something which is unbelievable. And I'll tell you, incredible Ramban, Bereshis Chafav, incredible Ramban, time and time again in Chumash, Asher Nishbati Lavram Yitzchak and Yaakov. No? Eretz Yisrael is yours, as I promised. From Yitzchak and Yaakov, Ramban, a very simple kasha. Go through Chumash. Where was there a haftacha to Yitzchak? You know what? You're not going to find one. There was a haftacha to Abraham Avinu, haftacha to Yaakov. There was no blatant Havtacha to Yitzchak. The Ramban writes, Bereshis Chafav, the only thing you're going to find is this pasuk. V'akimosi l'chas hashvua asher nishbati l'Avram avicha. Wow. Kadosh Baruch Hu said that through you, I'm going to fulfill the promise I made to your father. That is the shvua to Yitzchak. There was no independent shvua, but rather that which was promised to Avraham Avinu will be fulfilled through you and your zera. That's pretty stunning, no? There is no independent shvua, but rather this was an expansion of that which was promised to Avraham Avinu. There I would tell you in the sense lahalacha that Yitzchak was a perfect model of a tolda. Yitzchak was a tolda in the Torah and Tuma sense, and the Dinei Shabbos sense. He was an expansion, a harchava of, at the same time, obviously, he emanated from his father Avraham Avinu. So maybe all of that is meruma, simply in the very beginning of the parsha, that, Eila Toldos, already the Baal HaTosfos writes, that's referring to the expansion, the experiences, everything that occurred to Avraham Avinu replayed itself in the life of Yitzchak time and time and time again, the Yonason and beyond. And Avraham Holid says, yes, of course, that he was fathered by Avraham Avinu, right, with a dual sense of an Av and a Tolda. And that's the mission statement, the legacy, right? In order to see to it that one perpetuates, right, the legacy of the Avos. Tosas writes in Yevamos, Nachabes and Babes, that's the meaning of the word zera. Two differences daraisa between zera and ben. Zera is something which is enduring, but zera is only zera kosher, not zera pasal. And ben, Tosas writes, is only one generation, but it applies even to zera pasal. That's why Kiv Yitzchak Yikar Chazara, and typically Yishmael Beno. Yishmael was the Ben Avram, and Yitzchak was the Zera Avram. Right? That's a stunning statement, but Tosus. You almost have Chapez base. So that's our mission, our shlichus, what we have to grab onto in terms of that sense of the legacy of Avram Avinu. We are the Zera Avram, the Havtacha given to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the Achrayis. Avram Avinu Kiyum kol Torah kula kodem shenitna, and the need that we have to be able to embrace the legacy of Avram Avinu to its fullest. Sanhedrin is a beautiful masechta, as all are, but you can really move. Some masechtas, it's hard to go quickly. Then Sanhedrin you can really go, and you have to make a siyum on the masechta, and you'll figure out how to do it. You're capable now, and with Chazara, time after time, make sure it becomes, these Hagdaras become, part of who you are, something which is critically important. Okay, so Be'ezras Hashem, we should have that continued Siyata D'Shmai.